chin. Sarah Mitchell stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting her casual outfit one last time. The dark blue jeans and simple white blouse were a far cry from her usual police captain's uniform, but today was different. After 15 years of dedicated service in Chicago, she was starting fresh in Atlanta, and apartment hunting came before officially assuming her new role as precinct commander. The morning sun filtered through her hotel room window as she gathered her belongings. Her phone buzzed with a message from the real estate agent, confirming their meeting at 11 a.m. to view potential apartments in the upscale Brookhaven neighborhood. Sarah checked her watch, 9:30 a.m. She had plenty of time to take the bus and get a feel for her new jurisdiction from a civilian's perspective. As she walked through the hotel lobby, several guests smiled warmly at her. At 5'8" with an athletic build, Sarah carried herself with natural confidence. Her dark skin glowed with health, and her shoulder-length braids were neatly tied back. At 42, she had earned every commendation and promotion through hard work and determination, breaking through barriers as a black woman in law enforcement. The bus stop was only 2 blocks away. Sarah enjoyed the warm Georgia morning, so different from Chicago's lingering winter. She thought about her mother's reaction when she'd announced her transfer. "Atlanta? Baby, that's a whole different world down there," her mother had said. But Sarah was ready for change, eager to bring her experience and vision for community-oriented policing to a city known for its civil rights history. At the bus stop, Sarah found herself alone except for an elderly white couple sitting on the bench. She smiled at them and checked the bus schedule on her phone. The neighborhood was exactly as described: tree-lined streets, well-maintained houses, and expensive cars parked in driveways. This was where many of the city's affluent residents lived, including several local politicians and business leaders. Sarah's thoughts drifted to the challenges ahead. Her appointment as precinct commander had made headlines in local papers. She would be the first black woman to hold the position in this precinct's history. The police chief had been straightforward during her interview. The precinct needed changes, especially in community relations and officer conduct. Lost in thought, Sarah barely noticed when another person arrived at the bus stop. A young white woman in medical scrubs gave her a friendly nod before becoming absorbed in her phone. The morning was peaceful, birds chirping in the trees above, until the distinct sound of a police cruiser's engine broke the silence. Sarah watched with professional interest as the patrol car slowed near the bus stop. Her trained eye noticed everything: the car's number, the slight dent in the rear fender, and most importantly, the officer's demeanor as he stepped out. Something about his body language set off warning bells in her mind. Officer James Reynolds emerged from his vehicle with an air of authority that seemed forced. Sarah had seen it before: officers who confused aggression with command presence. He was in his mid-30s, average height, with close-cropped brown hair visible under his police cap. His hand rested casually on his belt, too close to his weapon for someone approaching a peaceful bus stop. "ID," he barked, walking directly to Sarah, completely ignoring the other people present. Sarah noticed how his eyes had immediately fixed on her, the only black person at the stop. She felt a familiar weight in her chest, the same one she carried as a rookie cop, facing discrimination from both citizens and fellow officers. Instead of reaching for her police credentials, which were safely tucked away in her hotel room, Sarah calmly reached for her regular wallet. Years of experience had taught her the value of seeing people's true colors. If Officer Reynolds was going to show his bias, she wanted to witness it firsthand. The elderly couple watched uncomfortably as Officer Reynolds positioned himself in what Sarah recognized as an unnecessarily aggressive stance. The young nurse had stopped looking at her phone, her expression shifting between concern and embarrassment at the scene unfolding before her. Sarah maintained her composure, drawing on years of training and experience. As she reached for her ID, she began mentally documenting every detail of the interaction. In just a few hours, she would be sitting behind the precinct commander's desk, and this encounter would tell her more about her new command than any personnel file ever could. Little did Officer Reynolds know that his next hour would become a turning point in his career, and the woman he was about to humiliate would soon hold his professional future in her hands. Officer Reynolds snatched the ID from Sarah's outstretched hand, barely glancing at it before launching into his interrogation. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded, his tone dripping with suspicion. The other passengers at the bus stop shifted uncomfortably, the morning silence broken by his harsh voice. "I'm here to view some apartments," Sarah replied calmly, noting how Reynolds' face twisted into a skeptical smirk. She had seen that look countless times before, the automatic disbelief that a black person could afford to live in an upscale area. Apartments? Here. Reynolds let out a short, mocking laugh. These units start at $3,000 a month. Are you sure you're in the right neighborhood? He emphasized the word right in a way that made his meaning crystal clear to everyone present. The elderly couple on the bench exchanged worried glances. The husband started to speak up but was silenced by a subtle squeeze of his wife's hand. The young nurse had pulled out her phone and was now quietly recording the interaction, her medical ID badge swinging slightly as she adjusted her position. I'm quite sure, Sarah responded, maintaining eye contact with Reynolds. She noticed his name tag was slightly crooked, his uniform wrinkled at the shoulders, small details that spoke of a casual approach to professional standards. May I have my ID back, Officer Reynolds? His grip tightened on her license. You know, we've had reports of suspicious people casing houses in this area. Looking at apartments, you say. Which real estate agent are you working with? His free hand still rested near his weapon, a subtle form of intimidation that Sarah recognized all too well. Sarah provided the agent's name and contact information, watching as Reynolds scribbled it in his notepad with unnecessary force. The tip of his pen nearly tore through the paper. I'll be checking this out, he warned, finally returning her ID by practically throwing it at her. A bus appeared in the distance, and Sarah could feel the collective relief from the other passengers. But Reynolds wasn't finished. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. Let me give you some friendly advice, he said, his voice low but clear enough for others to hear. This is a quiet, respectable neighborhood. We like to keep it that way. Maybe you should look somewhere more appropriate for your situation. The elderly woman gasped audibly at his words. The nurse's hand was shaking slightly as she continued recording, her face a mixture of shock and anger. Sarah remained still, her expression neutral as she committed every word to memory. Thank you for your concern, officer, Sarah replied, her voice steady. I'll certainly take that under advisement. She could read the confusion on Reynolds' face. Her composed response wasn't what he had expected or, perhaps, wanted. The bus was now pulling up to the stop, its brakes hissing as it came to a halt. Reynolds took a step back but couldn't resist one final jab. Just remember what I said. We'll be watching. He emphasized the we, making it clear he spoke for what he considered the neighborhood's rightful residents. As the bus doors opened, Sarah waited for the elderly couple to board first. The nurse quickly put away her phone and followed, throwing an apologetic look over her shoulder. Before boarding, Sarah turned to face Reynolds one last time. Officer Reynolds, she said, her voice clear and professional, could you confirm your badge number for me? I believe it's 47,831, correct? The color drained slightly from his face as she recited the number perfectly. She had memorized it the moment he stepped out of his car. How did you? He started, but Sarah was already climbing the bus steps. Through the window, she watched Reynolds stand there, uncertainty finally cracking his arrogant facade. He hadn't expected her to note his badge number. He hadn't expected her calm response to his intimidation, and he certainly wasn't expecting what would happen in the next hour. As the bus pulled away, Sarah checked her watch. It was 10:15 a.m. Her official introduction as the new precinct commander was scheduled for 11:30 a.m. She pulled out her phone and began typing notes about the incident, including exact quotes and timestamps. In just over an hour, Officer James Reynolds would learn a valuable lesson about judgment and prejudice, one that would shake the very foundation of his world. The other passengers on the bus gave her respectful nods, impressed by her dignity in the face of such blatant discrimination. None of them could have guessed that they had just witnessed the beginning of what would become a legendary story in the precinct's history. After the bus incident, Sarah decided to skip her apartment viewing. Instead, she directed the bus driver to let her off 3 blocks from the precinct. She needed time to process what had just happened and plan her next steps carefully. The morning sun was now high in the sky as she walked, her mind working through various approaches to handling the situation. The young nurse who had recorded the incident rushed to catch up with Sarah as they got off the bus. "Ma'am," she called out, slightly out of breath. "I had the whole thing recorded. What he did was completely wrong. I'd be happy to send you the video if you want to file a complaint." Sarah smiled warmly at the nurse, whose name tag read Jessica. "Thank you, Jessica. That's very kind of you. Could you send it to this email?" She handed Jessica her business card, keeping her thumb over her title. Jessica's eyes widened slightly at the police department email address, but to her credit, she didn't comment. After getting the video, Sarah stopped at a small cafe. She ordered a coffee and opened her laptop, beginning to type out a detailed report of the morning's events. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as she documented every word, gesture, and action of Officer Reynolds. Years of writing police reports had made her precise and thorough. While writing, Sarah accessed the precinct's internal database through her secure login. Officer James Reynolds' personnel file painted a disturbing picture. 6 complaints of racial bias in the past year alone, all mysteriously dismissed. Excellent marks in firearms and tactical training, but consistently poor ratings in community relations and cultural sensitivity. The cafe's bell chimed as the elderly couple from the bus stop walked in. Recognizing Sarah, they made their way to her table, where Tom and Martha, the woman, introduced themselves. "What happened this morning was shameful. We've lived here for 40 years, and we've seen too much of this behavior from certain officers." Sarah listened as they shared their observations of similar incidents in the neighborhood. Tom, a retired judge, offered his card and promised to support any action she decided to take. They had no idea they were speaking to the incoming commander, and Sarah maintained that anonymity, thanking them for their concern. As the morning wore on, Sarah received an email from Jessica containing the video footage. The recording was clear and damning, capturing every nuance of Reynolds' discriminatory behavior. Sarah added it to her growing file of evidence. At 11:15 a.m., Sarah left the cafe and walked to her hotel room. She changed into her formal uniform, each medal and commendation carefully positioned. The 4 stars of her rank gleamed on her collar. Looking in the mirror, she saw not just herself, but every black officer who had faced discrimination, every woman who had been underestimated, and every leader who had been forced to prove themselves twice over. The walk to the precinct took exactly 7 minutes. Sarah's boots clicked against the pavement with purpose, drawing attention from passers-by who noticed her commanding presence. At the precinct steps, she paused briefly, thinking about the contrast between this entrance and her treatment just over an hour ago. Inside, the desk sergeant jumped to attention, clearly expecting her arrival. "Captain Mitchell, welcome to Precinct 34. His enthusiasm suggested the chief had made sure everyone knew who she was. Everyone except, apparently, Officer Reynolds. Sarah was escorted to her new office, where she found it already arranged to department standards. On her desk sat the personnel files of all officers under her command. Reynolds' file was among them, now supplemented by her morning's documentation. The precinct's administrative assistant, Mrs. Johnson, knocked and entered. "Captain, the officers are assembled in the main conference room for your introduction. Officer Reynolds just arrived from patrol. He was almost late, but he made it." Sarah stood, straightening her uniform one last time. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. I'm ready." She gathered her notes and the video evidence, securing them in a folder. This moment wasn't just about confronting one officer's bias. It was about setting the tone for her entire command. As she walked toward the conference room, Sarah could hear the murmur of voices inside. She thought about Reynolds, probably sitting there completely unaware that his morning's actions would soon come back to face him. But this wouldn't be about revenge or humiliation. It would be about transformation, both for Reynolds and for the entire precinct. The room fell silent as Mrs. Johnson opened the door. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to begin the next chapter in both her career and the precinct's history. The conference room fell silent as Sarah stepped through the doorway. 30 pairs of eyes turned to watch her entrance, but she focused on just one face, Officer Reynolds, sitting in the back row. The color drained from his face as recognition dawned, his mouth falling slightly open in shock. "Good morning, officers. I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell, your new precinct commander." Her voice carried clearly through the room. She moved to the front with measured steps, noting how Reynolds seemed to shrink in his chair. The chief of police stood to formally introduce her, listing her achievements and credentials. "Captain Mitchell comes to us from Chicago with an impressive record of community policing reforms and departmental leadership. She holds a master's degree in criminal justice and has received numerous commendations for her work in building community trust." As the chief spoke, Sarah observed the room. Most officers sat at attention, showing appropriate respect. Some looked genuinely interested, others appeared neutral, and a few, mostly older officers, showed subtle signs of resistance to change. Reynolds had managed to compose himself somewhat, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "Thank you, Chief," Sarah said, taking the podium. "Before I share my vision for this precinct, I'd like to address something that happened this morning." She opened her folder and connected her laptop to the room's projection system. At approximately 9:45 a.m. today, I had an enlightening interaction with one of our officers while waiting at a bus stop in Brookhaven. The video from Jessica began playing on the screen. Officers shifted uncomfortably as they watched their colleagues' discriminatory behavior unfold. Reynolds' face now matched the pale gray of his uniform shirt. Other officers near him subtly moved their chairs away, creating a small island of isolation around him. Sarah paused the video. "Officer Reynolds, would you care to explain your actions?" Her voice remained professional, without a hint of the anger she had every right to feel. Reynolds stood shakily. "Captain, I was responding to reports of suspicious activity in the area." His voice cracked slightly. "I was just following standard procedure." "Standard procedure?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Is it standard procedure to make assumptions based on race? To imply that certain citizens don't belong in certain neighborhoods? To use body language suggesting readiness for violence while confronting an unarmed civilian at a bus stop?" The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Some officers looked at their boots, others watched with intense interest. This was clearly a defining moment for the precinct. "No, ma'am," Reynolds managed to say, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Sarah moved from behind the podium, addressing the entire room. "What happened this morning is a perfect example of why I'm here. This precinct has a history of complaints about bias, discriminatory practices, and broken community trust. That ends today." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the precinct's history of civilian complaints. These numbers tell a story of systemic issues that we must address, but they'd also represent an opportunity for transformation. Turning back to Reynolds, who was still standing, Sarah continued, "Officer Reynolds, report to my office immediately after this meeting. As for the rest of you, expect changes. We will be implementing comprehensive bias training, revising patrol protocols, and establishing new community engagement initiatives." The tension in the room was palpable. Some officers nodded in agreement, while others showed signs of resistance. Sarah noticed every reaction, making mental notes about potential allies and obstacles in her reform efforts. "I believe in second chances," she announced, her voice softening slightly. "I believe in the potential for growth and change, but I also believe in accountability. Each of you will be held to the highest standards of professional conduct, regardless of who you're interacting with or what neighborhood you're patrolling." As she concluded the meeting, Sarah noticed something unexpected. A small group of younger officers looking at her with clear admiration. They represented hope for the future, officers who might be ready to embrace change. "Dismissed," she said firmly. "Officer Reynolds, follow me." As the room cleared out, the atmosphere was charged with possibility. Some officers whispered among themselves, others walked in thoughtful silence. Reynolds stood rooted to his spot, waiting for everyone else to leave before making his way to the front of the room. The next few minutes would determine not just his future, but potentially set the tone for the entire precinct's transformation. Sarah gathered her materials, ready to have one of the most important conversations of her career. Sarah's office was bathed in late morning sunlight as Officer Reynolds entered, his confidence completely shattered. He stood at attention, staring straight ahead while Sarah settled into her chair behind the desk. The silence stretched for a full minute as she opened his personnel file. "Take a seat, Officer Reynolds," she finally said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. He sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The transformation from his earlier arrogant demeanor was remarkable. "I've reviewed your file thoroughly," Sarah began, turning pages in the folder. 6 complaints of racial bias in the past year. Outstanding tactical scores but poor community relations ratings. And now, this morning's incident." She closed the file and looked directly at him. "Tell me, what should I do with you?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "Captain, I can explain." Can you? Sarah interrupted softly. Can you explain why you immediately singled out the only black person at that bus stop? Why you felt the need to rest your hand near your weapon while speaking to someone who showed no signs of aggression? Why you thought it appropriate to suggest that certain people don't belong in certain neighborhoods? Sweat trickled down Reynolds' temple. I was following up on reports of suspicious activity, he repeated weakly. Sarah pulled out her phone and played an audio recording. It was the dispatch log from that morning. No reports of suspicious activity had been called in from that area. Reynolds' face fell further. Officer Reynolds, I could end your career right now, Sarah stated matter-of-factly. The video evidence alone would be enough. Add to that your history of complaints and this morning's false statement about responding to reports. She let the implications hang in the air. Reynolds seemed to deflate in his chair. Yes, ma'am, he whispered. But that's not why I'm here, Sarah continued, her tone shifting slightly. I'm here to make changes, not just end careers. So I'm going to offer you a choice. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the precinct parking lot where officers were going about their daily routines. Choice 1. I process your suspension papers right now, initiate a formal investigation into this morning's incident and your previous complaints, and let the chips fall where they may. Reynolds' knuckles went white as his hands clenched. Choice 2. Sarah turned back to face him. You become part of the solution. You take this moment as an opportunity for genuine change. It won't be easy. You'll attend extensive bias training, work with community outreach programs, and be partnered with Officer Chen, who has our best record in community relations. The silence that followed was heavy with significance. Reynolds looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes for the first time since entering her office. You give me that chance? After what I did? This morning, you showed me exactly who you are, Officer Reynolds. Now I'm offering you the opportunity to show me who you can become. Sarah returned to her desk and pulled out another folder. This is the curriculum for our new sensitivity training program. You'll be in the first group. You'll also spend time working with local community centers, getting to know the people you're supposed to protect and serve. Reynolds took a deep breath. Choice 2, Captain. I want to do better. Sarah nodded, studying his face for signs of sincerity. Understand this isn't just about saving your job. Real change requires genuine commitment. You'll be under close supervision, and any hint of biased behavior will result in immediate termination. I understand, Captain, Reynolds replied, his voice steadier now. Good. Report to Officer Chen tomorrow morning. For the next month, you'll be on community patrol only. No traffic stops, no solo operations. She handed him a thick packet of documents. Read these materials tonight. They include statistics on racial bias in policing, personal accounts from community members, and the department's new guidelines for community interaction. As Reynolds stood to leave, Sarah added one final point. Officer Reynolds, remember how it felt this morning when you realized who I was. Remember that any person you interact with could be someone's boss, someone's parent, someone's community leader. Every person deserves the same respect, regardless of their position or appearance. Reynolds nodded, clutching the papers to his chest. As he reached the door, he paused. Captain Mitchell, I'm sorry. For this morning. For everything. Prove it, Sarah replied simply. Not with words, but with actions. After Reynolds left, Sarah sat back in her chair, reviewing her notes from the morning. The precinct's transformation had begun, and while she knew there would be resistance and challenges ahead, this first test had shown her that change was possible, one officer at a time. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's confrontation with Officer Reynolds. The precinct was buzzing with activity as she reviewed the morning reports in her office. Officer Chen's latest evaluation of Reynolds lay open on her desk, and the contents were surprisingly positive. He's different, Chen had written. The change seems genuine. Yesterday, he spent 2 hours helping an elderly black woman find her lost grandson, well past our shift end. He didn't even mention overtime. Sarah looked up as Mrs. Johnson knocked on her door. Captain, the community center representatives are here for the meeting. She stood and straightened her uniform, ready to face another challenge in her precinct reform plan. The conference room held an interesting mix of people. Local community leaders, mostly black and Hispanic, sat on one side of the table. On the other side were her officers, including Reynolds, who sat quietly near the middle. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah began, taking her place at the head of the table. "We're here to discuss the new community policing initiative and hear your concerns directly." Marcus Thompson, a respected local pastor, spoke first. "Captain Mitchell, we appreciate your efforts. We've had these meetings before. What makes this different?" Before Sarah could respond, Reynolds raised his hand slightly. "Permission to speak, Captain." The room fell silent. Everyone knew about the bus stop incident. It had become something of a legend in the community. Sarah nodded, curious about what Reynolds would say. "Mr. Thompson, 2 weeks ago, I was part of the problem," Reynolds began, his voice steady but humble. "I treated someone with disrespect and bias because of their race. That someone turned out to be Captain Mitchell, but it shouldn't have mattered who it was. It was wrong, period." The community leaders leaned forward, listening intently as Reynolds continued. "Since then, I've been working with Officer Chen in your neighborhoods. I've learned names, stories, met families. I was wrong about so many things, and I'm not afraid to admit that anymore." Sarah watched the faces around the table. Some showed skepticism, others hope. Mrs. Washington, a longtime community activist, spoke up. "Officer Reynolds, I remember when you gave my grandson a hard time last year for no reason. Are you saying you've changed?" Reynolds met her gaze directly. "Mrs. Washington, I remember that day too. I was wrong. Your grandson was just walking home from basketball practice, and I assumed things I had no right to assume. I'd like to apologize to him in person, if you'd allow it." The room shifted. This wasn't the scripted apology they'd expected. Sarah noticed several community leaders exchanging impressed looks. "Captain Mitchell isn't just changing policies," Reynolds continued. "She's changing mindsets. At least, she changed mine. We have a long way to go, but we're learning. I'm learning." Sarah took this moment to introduce the new initiatives: joint community police events, regular forums for addressing concerns, transparency in complaint investigations, and a citizen oversight committee. But it was Reynolds' unexpected testimony that had broken the ice. As the meeting progressed, other officers began sharing their experiences with the new training programs. The community leaders, initially defensive, started opening up about their hopes for better police-community relations. Near the end of the meeting, Marcus Thompson addressed Reynolds directly. "Officer, my youth group meets on Thursdays. Would you consider coming to speak to our young people, share your journey?" Reynolds looked at Sarah, who nodded her approval. "I'd be honored, sir. Though I should warn you, Officer Chen might want to come along to make sure I'm doing it right." This earned a light chuckle from the room. As people filed out after the meeting, Sarah overheard snippets of conversation that gave her hope. Officers and community members were exchanging contact information, making plans for future discussions. Reynolds was the last to leave. "Captain," he said, posing at the door, "thank you. Not just for giving me a second chance, but for showing me why I needed one." Sarah smiled. "You did the hard work, Officer Reynolds. Keep it up." Alone in the conference room, Sarah reflected on the meeting's success. Real change was happening, not just in policies and procedures, but in hearts and minds. The incident at the bus stop, though troubling, had become a catalyst for transformation. She gathered her notes, already planning the next steps in her precinct's evolution. The road ahead was still long, but today had shown that even the deepest biases could be overcome with the right combination of accountability, opportunity, and leadership. 3 months after the bus stop incident, Sarah sat in her office reviewing the quarterly statistics. The numbers told a remarkable story. Civilian complaints had dropped by 60%, community engagement was at an all-time high, and officer satisfaction scores had improved significantly. A knock on her door interrupted her analysis. Officer Reynolds stood there, holding a folder and looking considerably more at ease than he had that first day in her office. "Captain, do you have a moment?" Sarah gestured for him to enter. Reynolds had become one of the precinct's success stories, though she knew better than to say that out loud. His transformation had inspired other officers to embrace the changes she'd implemented. The youth program at Pastor Thompson's church, Reynolds began, opening his folder. "We've had an interesting development. Remember those teenagers who used to hang out behind the convenience store, the ones everyone complained about? Sarah nodded. Those complaints had been frequent when she first took command. Well, they've started coming to our sessions. At first, they just sat in the back, probably expecting us to hassle them. But last week, something amazing happened. Reynolds pulled out several photographs. They organized a basketball game, police versus teenagers. We lost badly, but look at these. The photos showed officers and young people laughing together, high-fiving, sharing water bottles. In one picture, Reynolds was teaching a young man proper shooting form, both of them grinning at the camera. That's Marcus, Reynolds explained. He's Mrs. Washington's grandson, the one I wrongly stopped last year. He's applying to the police academy next spring. Asked me to be his reference. Sarah studied Reynolds' face, seeing genuine pride there. How does that make you feel, being asked to be his reference? Honestly, it's humbling, Reynolds replied. 3 months ago, I was part of the problem. Now, I might help this young man become part of the solution. It's not something I take lightly. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Johnson's voice on the intercom. Captain, the news crew is here for your interview about the community policing program. Sarah stood, straightening her uniform. The local news had been following the precinct's transformation, particularly after the bus stop video had gone viral. She'd initially been reluctant about the publicity, but Chief Thompson had insisted it could serve as a model for other departments. Officer Reynolds, she said, would you like to join me for this interview? Share your perspective on the changes? Reynolds looked surprised. Are you sure, Captain? Given how things started. That's exactly why, Sarah replied. Real change isn't about hiding our mistakes, it's about showing how we learn from them. As they walked to the conference room where the news crew was setting up, they passed the precinct's newly installed community board. It was covered with photos of recent events. Police officers reading to elementary school children, community cleanup days, joint training sessions with neighborhood watch groups. In the center was a group photo from last week's community barbecue, showing officers and residents sharing meals and conversation. The reporter, Lisa Chen, greeted them warmly. Captain Mitchell, Officer Reynolds, thank you for agreeing to this interview. We're particularly interested in how your precinct achieved such dramatic improvements in community relations. It started with a bus stop, Sarah began, glancing at Reynolds, who nodded his agreement. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments. As the interview progressed, Reynolds spoke candidly about his journey from being part of the problem to becoming an advocate for change. He described the youth programs, the community outreach efforts, and the ongoing training that had helped officers recognize and address their biases. The most important thing I've learned, Reynolds said toward the end of the interview, is that good policing isn't about power or authority. It's about service and understanding. Captain Mitchell taught me that, not just through policies, but through example. After the news crew left, Sarah and Reynolds stood looking at the community board again. Did you ever imagine this 3 months ago? She asked. Reynolds shook his head. That morning at the bus stop, I thought my career was over. Instead, it was just beginning, the right way this time. Sarah smiled, remembering her own uncertainty when she'd first taken command. Change isn't easy, she said, but it's always possible. As they headed back to their duties, both knew that their work wasn't finished. True transformation was an ongoing process, but they had proven that with the right leadership, commitment, and willingness to learn from mistakes, even the deepest divides could be bridged. 1 year after the infamous bus stop incident, the precinct gathered for its annual community awards ceremony. The station's largest conference room had been transformed for the occasion, with rows of chairs filled with officers, community members, and local officials. Sarah stood at the podium, surveying the diverse crowd before her. The change in the room was palpable. Gone was the invisible line that used to separate. A year ago, Sarah began, this precinct was known for its divisions. Today, we're known for our unity. She gestured to the wall behind her, where the precinct's new motto hung, serving together, growing together. In the front row, Officer Reynolds sat next to Marcus Washington, now a police academy cadet. Mrs. Washington sat on Marcus's other side, beaming with pride. The transformation of their relationship had become a symbol of the precinct's larger change. Today, We're not just celebrating improvements in statistics, Sarah continued. We're celebrating real changes in people's lives. She began listing the year's achievements. Crime rates down by 40%, community trust at record highs, and a waiting list of officers requesting transfers to their precinct. The first award of the day went to Officer Chen for his mentorship program that had helped change the culture of the force. As he accepted his award, he specifically thanked Reynolds for being his most dedicated student. Then came a special moment that Sarah had carefully planned. Our next award, she announced, is the first annual Bridge Builder Award, given to someone who exemplifies the spirit of positive change and community connection. The room grew quiet as Sarah continued. A year ago, this officer and I had a confrontation at a bus stop. It could have ended his career. Instead, it became the beginning of an extraordinary transformation. She paused, looking directly at Reynolds. Officer James Reynolds, please come forward. Reynolds walked to the podium, visibly moved. The applause was genuine and warm, led by the very community members who had once filed complaints against him. Officer Reynolds didn't just change himself, Sarah explained. He became a catalyst for change throughout our precinct. His work with youth programs, his honesty about his past mistakes, and his dedication to building trust have inspired both officers and community members. As Reynolds accepted the award, he spoke from the heart. A year ago, I was part of the problem. Captain Mitchell could have ended my career that day. Instead, she showed me how to become part of the solution. He turned to the audience. This award belongs to everyone in this room. We all built these bridges together. The ceremony continued with more awards and recognitions, but the most powerful moment came at the end. Marcus Washington took the podium to announce his acceptance into the police academy. Standing in his cadet uniform, he represented the future they were all working toward. When Officer Reynolds stopped me that day last year, Marcus said, "I was afraid of the police. Now, I want to be one, not despite what happened, but because I've seen how people can change, how communities can heal." After the ceremony, Sarah watched as officers and community members mingled over refreshments. Reynolds was showing Mrs. Washington pictures from the latest youth basketball tournament on his phone. Officer Chen was discussing plans for a new mentorship program with Pastor Thompson. Everywhere she looked, she saw the fruits of their collective effort to create change. Her phone buzzed with a message from the police chief. Their precinct's community policing model was being adopted by departments across the state. What had started with a confrontation at a bus stop had grown into something much larger than any of them had imagined. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself back at that same bus stop where it all began. The neighborhood hadn't changed physically, but everything else had. A patrol car pulled up. It was Reynolds, finishing his shift. "Heading home, Captain?" he asked through the window. Sarah nodded. "Just taking a moment to remember where we started." Reynolds looked at the bus stop thoughtfully. "You know, I drive by here every day on patrol. It reminds me to be the officer I should have been from the start." "Keep being that officer, Reynolds," Sarah replied, "and keep helping others do the same." As Reynolds drove away and Sarah walked toward her car, she reflected on how a single moment of confrontation had led to a year of transformation. The work wasn't over. It never would be, but they had proved that change was possible, one person, one interaction, one day at a time. The precinct had become more than just a model for police reform. It had become a testament to the power of leadership, accountability, and the human capacity for change. And it all started at a bus stop.